Good evening. I am Julia Marjari Alexander. I am the Andrea B. and John H. Laporte Director of the Walters Art Museum. I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight. We have such fun at these Boshell lectures, and tonight's lecture is going to be a particular treat, and we are going to hear about Blackness in Antiquity. So at our institution, as many of you know, our work is to broaden the understanding of the histories of people across time and across the globe, and also the histories of objects that we steward in our collection. So to do that work, we have to support the awareness of the histories that have led us to our present moment. And as such, I will now read our Indigenous Land and Cultural Heritage Acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects that we steward in our collection. Our program this evening on Blackness in Antiquity is part of our semi-annual Boshell Lecture Series. At the Walters, this series began in 2017, and through these extraordinary lectures that are due to the generosity of the Boshell Foundation, we have had the opportunity to invite internationally renowned and recognized speakers to present on a variety of topics that have all been related to the ancient world. As ever, these talks, as are all talks, are available on site, here you are, on site, and online, and they are always free. Most of all, these programs, such as today's talk, make plain to all of us how deeply the past inhabits our present. How what seems new is often ancient, and what is our responsibility to understand how the ways of the past have been presented and how they have been presented across time continues on a daily basis to affect our present. So on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Walters and the staff of the Walters, I want you all to help me thank the Boshell Foundation. Some members who they were supposed to be here, but they got caught in traffic, so I'm not seeing them. But let's give them a, hi, okay, yay, Betsy, Boshell Foundation. Truly, your generous support makes this lecture series one of the highlights, two of the highlights of every year. So this evening, as I've said 3 times, we'll focus on Blackness in Antiquity, and more specifically, Roman antiquity. I have the tremendous pleasure and honor of introducing our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Dan-el Padilla Peralta. Dr. Padilla Peralta is an associate professor of classics at Princeton University. His work focuses on religions and politics of the Roman Republic and Empire. And his approach shuttles between literary and material sources as well as socio-scientific sources. He's the author of 2 books, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy Leagues, Penguin 2015, and Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, from Princeton in 2020. In addition to these single-authored books, he has co-edited 2 volumes, Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, and that was with Matthew Loar and Carolyn MacDonald from Cambridge in 2017. And Making the Middle Republic, New Approaches to Rome and Italy, circa 400 to 200 BCE. And that was with his colleagues, Seth Barnard and Lisa Mignone. That was from Cambridge in 2023. So that's new. That's great. Following the presentation, Dr. Padilla Peralta will be joined by our very own Dr. Gina Borromeo, the Walters Senior Director of Collections and Curatorial Affairs, and its Senior Curator of ancient art. So it's really great to hear Gina tonight on her own field of expertise in conversation. Together, they will discuss the connections between antiquity and the present day, and then open for a Q&A with you. Dr. Padilla Peralta is the foremost expert on tonight's subject, and we really are fortunate to have you here tonight to give us not only an overview of your work, but also to talk about how your subject of antiquity really does reflect every day in our lives. So I want to welcome to our stage Dr. Dan-el Padilla Peralta. Dan-el.
Thank you. So thank you, Julia, for the introduction, the Boshell Foundation for its support for this lecture series, the Walters Art Museum for extending the invitation, and the staff of the Walters Art Museum, and specifically Paloma, who has been instrumental in organizing my visit, and Gina, with whom I will be in conversation in a short while. It is a true pleasure to be in your company today. I must start by gently correcting Julia in one respect, which is that she was very kind to credit me as an expert, but what I will be doing is holding out for your contemplation the work of those whom I see as experts on this subject. This lecture will, if it proves successful, introduce you all to the approaches and methods modeled by a generation of scholarship on Blackness in antiquity and on race and racialization in antiquity that to me has been nothing short of game-changing. So I see my work as, in the first instance, devoted to proselytizing. I get to talk about people whose work I admire and brag about them before you. What I do also want to say, by way of general introduction, is that the title for today's lecture, Blackness in Antiquity, is not without its own need for interrogation. Because the title, if one wants to think about it in mirror or inverted terms, invites the question, is there whiteness in antiquity? Or is it that whiteness in antiquity is taken for granted? Is it that antiquity and whiteness are brought together in association in the minds of those who think about antiquity and in the minds of those of us who are reacting to the presence of different kinds of antiquity in contemporary spaces? This is very much an issue that I hope we can take up in the Q&A. But for now, I want to emphasize two baselines for our conversation. In order to talk about Blackness in antiquity, we have to first have a robust concept of what Black and Blackness are. And to this end, I am going to make use of the extraordinary work published by Sarah Durbow, Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity, a book that I recommend enthusiastically to all of you, and that has been rightly lauded already within 2 years of its publication as an instant classic. One of the challenges that Professor Durbow addresses in the book is how to talk about Blackness in antiquity. And so let me read to you what she lays out in describing the choices that she makes in her book. I have thought carefully, Durbow writes, about the orthography of Blackness I use in this book. I have adopted a referential practice in which I shift between Black, lowercase b, and Black, uppercase b. Lowercase Black denotes people with Black skin and phenotypic features, including full lips, curly hair, and a broad nose in ancient Greek literature and art, while uppercase Black refers to a modern, socially constructed group of people whose melanin is merely one of its distinguishing traits. Due to the numerous Greek terms employed to categorize Black people, a transliterated label is not a suitable alternative, end quote. I want you all to sit with this for the remainder of my presentation. and to sit with it as we progress into the Q&A. Because Derbo's effort at clarification brings immediately to the forefront one of the singular challenges associated with thinking about Blackness in antiquity. There is, first of all, the fact that Blackness in antiquity is not necessarily equal to or coextensive with how we, in our 21st century moment, understand Blackness. But there's also a challenge that arises when we think about the fact that there are vocabularies in antiquity for describing different forms of coloration and of melanation that are not equivalent to vocabularies that we make regular use of now. To tackle head-on some of the secondary challenges that this presents, we need another set of tools related to the ones that Derbo showcases and wields to great effect in her book. We need tools for talking about race and racialization in the ancient world. One of the reasons why we need these tools is, as Derbo brings out in her book, that when we look at how modern and contemporary discussions of objects from the Greek and Roman Mediterranean describe the representation of differentiated others, we see regularly and insistently that, by and large, scholars can't avoid falling into the trap of mobilizing their own racial categories from the contemporary moment to talk about forms of representation in Greco-Roman antiquity. This challenge comes online whenever we encounter objects such as the one that you see on this slide. This is a janiform or two-faced canthros with the heads of, and now I read from the description of this object provided on the Princeton Art Museum website, a male African and a female Greek. Here is Derbo's description of this object in Untangling Blackness. Quote, "A curly-haired black face with full lips and a broad nose appears on the left-hand side, and a headband-wearing brown face with thin lips and a narrow nose on the right. The fused clay, most apparent at the neck of the cup, draws attention to the inexorable connection between the two faces. On the whole, the cup invites multiple versions of difference in that viewers may understand the two faces as opposing or complementary," end quote. It is with this and other descriptions that Derbo seeks to neutralize and offset the tendency evident in scholarship on this object and on similar objects to link up the representation of difference with specific ethnic assignments in antiquity, i.e. the idea that this blackface must of necessity represent an African, or the idea that this headband-wearing brown face must of necessity represent a Greek. Again, though, in order to push ahead with an understanding of why it's important to engage in the kind of work that Derbo undertakes in her book, we need some tools. We need a definition of race and a definition of racialization that can help us understand why forms of difference in antiquity, as registered on the cup that you saw on the preceding slide, interact with, and to a certain extent even mirror, but also diverge from, some of the forms of racialization that are known and apparent to us. In order to set out more clearly how I think it useful to understand race and racialization, I turn now to a book that has made waves since its publication in 2018, Jerry Heng's The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages. This is a book with a remarkable but quite complex definition of race. And I'm going to read this definition and then offer some comments intended to simplify it, to give you a clearer grasp of what is at stake in the definition itself and how we might put it to productive use in our work together tonight. Race, Heng writes, is one of the primary names we have, a name we retain for the strategic, epistemological, and political commitments it recognizes, that is attached to a repeating tendency of the gravest import to demarcate human beings through differences among humans that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental, in order to distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups. Race-making thus operates as specific historical occasions in which strategic essentialisms are posited and assigned to a variety of practices and pressures so as to construct a hierarchy of peoples for differential treatment. My understanding, thus, is that race is a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences rather than a substantive content, end quote. I love this definition, even though it's really intricate. Why? There are two aspects of this definition that straight away should matter to our discussions tonight. First, Heng is not content with understanding race and racialization or race-making as a process that occurs only in, say, the early modern world, or the modern 20th century, or the contemporary 21st century. She develops an account of race that extends backward deep into time, that acknowledges race as one of the primary names we have that is attached to a repeating tendency to demarcate human beings. The other feature of this, and the reason why the title of Heng's book itself is fraught with significance, is that in setting up a definition of race that acknowledges that race and race-making extend deep back into the historical record, Heng is participating in a conversation about the historical origins of race and racism. And this is a conversation that has been alive and well in ancient studies and in Greco-Roman studies for quite some time. For much of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, a scholar named Frank Snowden, who taught at Howard for many years, mustered together an impressive body of evidence across multiple books to contend that racism as we understand it in the modern and contemporary moment did not exist in antiquity. And specifically, that biological racism, as we understand it, did not exist in antiquity. There have been a lot of challenges raised in response to Snowden's work over the years. Most prominently, the scholar Benjamin Isaac, in a book entitled The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, sought to show that there are forms of proto-racism that exist in the ancient world. They might not be equivalent to the forms of racism best known to us, but they do participate in what Heng would describe as essentializing difference. They seek to describe certain communities as having characteristics, whether deriving from where they reside or deriving from their bodies, that set them apart from other human communities. And this is crucial for following the definition of race and racism that is developed at length in Heng's work, this form of essentialism, assigning these unique traits to different communities that are seen as rooted fundamentally in what those communities are, can, in some cases, be passed down hereditarily. We do then, contrary to what Snowden argued across multiple decades of his life, have evidence to suggest that a form of racism linked up to concepts of heredity did exist in antiquity. But this has implications that extend well beyond the business of definitions itself. And here's where we get to talking about some objects. In the final stretch of my remarks before we turn over to the conversation, I want briefly to give you an idea of the many different forms of representation that traffic in and make use of differences in shade, coloring, and material to capture forms of difference. I'd start with this head of a man that's at the Walters Art Museum. That's from Egypt. It's dated to sometime between the 2nd century BC and early 1st century CE, and it's made of granodiorite. It is made out of a material that is quite dark. If you look at the Walters Art Museum website, you'll see that there is an attempt to differentiate between the Egyptian elements of the stone and of this head and the naturalistic, delicate modeling of the cheeks. This is assigned to Greek influence. But what I want to emphasize with this passage, and what I want to hold out as an invitation to all of you to think about for our conversation together, is that this distinction itself, far from recovering an operative distinction in antiquity between Egyptian or Greek elements, actually reinstates and creates a form of racializing difference. So here is where we get to one of the takeaways of Heng's work that's actually really important for the conversation that we need to have tonight. In the scholarly practices that emerge around these artifacts from antiquity, scholars cannot but help fall into the trap of making racializing judgments, even when they proceed on what they understand to be perfectly sound grounds. There is still another dimension worth flagging here, which brings me to this lovely piece, Etruscan in origin, from the 4th century BC, very close to the period in time in central Italy that I study. And that is, as we'll discuss in our exchange in a few minutes, there is linked to the study of ancient statuary, of racializing assumption that in its most ideal forms, that statuary was white, was brilliantly white. And yet we have all of these signs from different communities across the Mediterranean of the importance of painting statuary, of painting it in rich and evocative hues. And we can even see traces of paint on bits of relief work and anafix work, such as this piece here. Crucial to understanding, though, the working of race and racialization in antiquity is another facet of Heng's definition that I have so far underplayed. In talking about things like blackness in antiquity, and in emphasizing the extent to which race is read on the face or on the body by virtue of skin color, I am participating in a time-honored tradition of assuming that the location of race is epidermal. In other words, that race is just skin deep. But actually, this is not at all true either for antiquity or for modernity. And one of the interesting features of items such as this barbarian soldier is that we see as one element of the construction of racial difference in antiquity an emphasis on clothing. And to wrap up, we're going to look at a passage that makes that association quite clear. But this item that you see on this slide is important for another reason. It goes through the hands of a dealer in the early 1900s named Arthur Sambon. And for folks who might be interested in researching further how racial concepts and racial ideas enter into the mainstream of talking about Greco-Roman objects, a figure like Sambon is not a bad place to start. As it turns out, this dealer, who was also very important in the study of coins and who holds a really significant place in the identification of coins that have racializing depictions of Africans on them, is a really important interlocutor for some of the trends that we see in scholarship and in descriptions of racialization in objects in the early 20th century. And he's involved in routing this artifact to the Walters. The final points I want to make, though, concern a feature of racialization that, for all that it may seem at first blush separate from blackness, is actually kind of central to understanding the dynamics of coloration in antiquity. Look at this bust of Serapis, the divinity from Egypt. It's this beautiful blue. One of the great undertakings of the past few years, exemplified by the work of folks like Jenny Stager and others, has been to better conceptualize in the round the many and varied hues that are used to distinguish divinities from non-divinities, Greeks from non-Greeks, Romans from non-Romans in the Mediterranean world. And what I want to emphasize for our conversation in the remaining half hour is that this was a work of difference and of constructing difference that made use of many different colors on the spectrum. Blue is especially charged because its use in creating and distinguishing human from non-human forms is already apparent in the writings of the Greek epic poet Homer, but we can do this work with other colors as well. Part of our work together has to involve thinking critically, not just about blackness, but as I said at the outset, about whiteness, and about the changing significations of whiteness in antiquity too. Any effort to think about blackness has to begin by taking into account the extent to which whiteness was not in antiquity normatively constructed as unequivocally more valuable than other forms of coloration. And in fact, if we look at the different gradients or shades of whiteness that are apparent in some of the objects that survive for us to see from the Roman world, we can see that these subtle distinctions in color themselves speak volume about the extent to which whiteness was far from being a hegemonic norm, i.e., the one overridingly prioritized skin color to dwarf all other skin colors in valuation. But I'll conclude with a passage that attempts to bring all of these various threads home. It's a passage that I turn to often in conversations with my students because it seems to me to do an excellent job at underscoring how, at the end of the day, skin color and race on the epidermis is but one feature of racialization in antiquity. The passage is taken from a novel, Petronius's Satirica. This is a Roman novel of the 1st century CE, probably composed under the Emperor Nero, although there's some discussion that it may have actually been put together sometime later. And in one of the scenes that is rich with significance for understanding how race is represented literarily, we see 3 characters, Eumolpus, Giton, and Encolpius, discover that 2 of their enemies are traveling on the same ship as they are. And so they try to find an escape plan, and Encolpius has an idea. Consider this plan I just thought of. Eumolpus, as literary man, is sure to have some ink. With this means let us change our color from head to foot. And so, like Ethiopian slaves, we will also be at your service, cheerful without the severity of tortures, and by changing the color of our bodies, we will trick our enemies. Why not? Said Giton. And while you're at it, circumcise us so that we look like Jews. Pierce our ears so that we imitate Arabs, and chalk our faces so Gaul thinks we are her citizens. As if this new color alone could undo our shape, and it were unnecessary that many things be consistent to make a successful deception from every angle. Suppose that the stain of dye applied to our faces can last for some time. Imagine that a sprinkling of water will not leave any spot on our body, and that our clothes will not stick to the ink, which happens often even when glue is not applied. But tell me, can we fill out our lips for that hideously swollen look? Can we change our hair with curling tongs? Can we cut up our foreheads to leave scars? Can we make ourselves bow-legged? Can we bend our ankles to the ground? Or trim our beards to a foreign cut? Artificial colors stain the body without changing the shape. Listen to the solution of a scared person. Let us tie our heads in our clothes and drown ourselves in the deep ocean. Now, I'm glad that y'all folks found that passage funny. But there is a deeper significance to the position staked out here, and it's one that we'll do well to think through in the remainder of our time together. It is that race and racialization proceed by reference to multiple interlocking attributes, some of which are mapped on to the body itself, others of which interface with properties of dress, and all of them together have to be locked in dialogue for there to be a coherent racial representation of a subject. In other words, no one element of the ones enumerated here would be sufficient to racialize a person as Ethiopian or as Jewish or as Arab or, for that matter, as Gallic. It is the grouping together of these different features of difference that together serves to constitute a racial subject in the Roman world. This is why thinking about Blackness and Antiquity is ultimately impossible without thinking about the whole complex array of tools at the disposal of Romans and Greeks and other Mediterranean communities for constructing racial difference. And these tools involve not just the registering of skin color and melanation, but the development of an entire armory of dress and associated other forms of bodily disposition in order to communicate what race and racialization are. So with that, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. We transition to conversation.
Dan-el, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, really, to decades of scholarship that you really wonderfully synthesized for us today. And I am really just so grateful to be sharing the stage with you. I just have to admit that. So anyway, I have a lot of questions, but I think that one of the things that I wanted to bring up today is the nature of the evidence that we have for thinking about race, racialization, and even racism in antiquity. You know, you brought to bear today a really robust body of evidence that through which we can begin to think about the questions of how the ancients conceived of race. And you showed us literary evidence, you showed us all types of works that are also really rich in the way you've interpreted them. So what I want to ask you is, to go a little bit more into the discussion of the nature of the evidence and how carefully we must read them, because as you said, we always have the lens of our 21st century lives when we look at works in the ancient world, and especially when we think about concepts like race, for which the ancient Greeks and Romans did not even have a word. So I throw that to you.
That's a fantastic question with which to start. So I'll start by emphasizing that we have an incredibly varied body of evidence for thinking about race and racialization in antiquity. But in order to even begin interpreting that evidence, there are a few questions that we have to answer as scholars and as interested enthusiasts for the Greco-Roman world and the greater Afro-Eurasian Mediterranean. So here are these questions. The first one is actually quite basic. Do we believe that forms of race and racialization existed in the ancient world? Now, I pose this question as one that needs to be answered before engaging the evidence, partly because it may occur to many of you that it's important simply to look at the evidence and then derive from the evidence an understanding of whether race and racialization exist in the ancient world and or what forms race and racialization might take in the ancient world. But I think it's actually quite important to enter into the space of interpreting that evidence with a clear idea of what we are bringing into that interpretation a prioristically, right? Do we already believe that it's a thing that exists and that we can look for? Do we believe with Jerry Hang that race is just one of the names that we have for a pattern, a tendency that recurs across history, or not? If one does believe that it is more likely than not that we will encounter forms of race and racialization in the ancient evidence, then the next question becomes, all right, what are the kinds of evidence that we are going to be scrutinizing in order to determine and gauge the operations of race and racialization? We have literary evidence of various kinds. We have material culture and art evidence of various kinds. But with the interpretation of any of these, there are some cautions that are in order. First, on the literary side, we have, especially for certain periods of the Mediterranean, and especially for stretches of the early and high Roman Empire, a phenomenal array of literary evidence. some of which is quite explicit in using forms of xenophobic and otherwise othering language in order to flag perceived outliers to Roman identity, and some of which is more subtle, right? But here the challenge is twofold. First of all, how do we understand the relationship of that literary evidence, which by and large is written by an elite, to broader understandings of what race and racialization look like in the Roman world? Can we generalize from, say, a passage in the poetry of the Roman Juvenal excoriating the presence of non-Roman others in Rome, to a set of claims about race and racialization as operative systems for division and world-making in the population at large? This is a pretty big question. To look at the material evidence, though, for a moment, I want to draw briefly your attention to one item that I didn't feature in the slideshow. When Frank Snowden went about the task many years ago of collecting evidence for the representation of blacks in antiquity, he was exhaustive in finding in pretty much every corner of the material culture and our historical record for ancient Greece and Rome evidence for the representation of blacks. To use Sarah Durbo's orthography, blacks with a lowercase b. Now, what he then went on to argue was that to a large extent, this representation, while showing us that, especially in some corners of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, there was a real sort of interest verging on fixation with the black form, abided by certain basic principles of representation. Snowden was also committed to the idea that this in and of itself did not tell us anything about the existence or absence of biological racism. But this is where we have to go back to that question that I set out at the beginning of my answer to your prompt right now. One has to do some thinking beforehand, not just about whether one believes that race or racism existed in antiquity, but what a valid definition of race and racism in antiquity might look like, might entail. Because, as several people have recently argued, the fact that we see so much overrepresentation of black forms, black bodies, black faces, associated with certain kinds of instruments of service in antiquity, may actually tell us something. When you see a janiform cup of vase of the kind that you saw on your slides, what might that tell you about the understanding according to which this particular form of othering is linked to the provision of a certain kind of service with this vase? And we can do a version of this with many other sorts of evidence. So for this work, it's important to be critical on two fronts. We need to think first about the evidence itself, and then we also need to think about the methods at our disposal for analyzing it.
I also want to add that I think the context for these things are important. In that particular janiform cup that you showed us earlier, these are objects that we think, well, we know were used in symposia in the Greek world, but the truth is a lot of these objects were actually found in Etruria, buried in tombs. And so the context it also matters, not just, we need to think about who used these objects and for what purposes. And so I think that is, that's just another thing to think about when we think about
Absolutely.
when we think about the evidence. And so I am going to ask kind of a difficult question here, and I think it is actually embedded in it. You have alluded to it in your discussion today, and this I will be reading a quote from Benjamin Isaac's book, where he talks about giving the Greeks and Romans their due. So Benjamin Isaac, in The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, actually says, "This study is an attempt to give the Greeks and Romans their due. If they have given us, through their literature, many of the ideas of freedom, democracy, philosophy, novel artistic concepts, and so much else that we regard as essential in our culture, it should be recognized that the same literature also gave us some of the elementary concepts of discrimination and inequality that are still with us. So, it's just kind of worth mentioning here as well that the founding fathers of this very country were all steeped in the study of Greek and Latin. And so I'd like to toss that humdinger of a question at you.
Yeah, that's a real humdinger. Yeah, I mean, so my response to Isaac is complicated because, on the one hand, there's a elegant simplicity to how he puts things that I find compelling. Mm-hmm. So I could just leave it at that and say, yep, seems right, seems right to me, and just call it a day. But I think the reason my response to it is complicated is twofold. First, in order to make full sense of Isaac's claim, we would need to do some serious thinking about transmission, and specifically the transmission of those ideas as they take shape in the Greek and Roman Mediterranean, and as they then, across many centuries and across many cultural formations, reach us in some way. So to be more exacting or more precise about that, one needs to look in particular at moments where ideas taken from the ancient Greek and Roman world get repurposed in ways that directly inform the shaping of early modern, and contemporary constructs of race, right? So here is one illustration of this that has come up from time to time in several of the courses that I teach. It is, as some of you will know, and as the presentation today will have hopefully made somewhat clearer, not at all obvious that blackness understood as an epidermal assignment, strictly on the basis of looking at someone and determining that they were black, or blackness is understood as a feature of physiognomy and of the body that is ascribed to a geographic origin, was the focus of unequivocal discrimination in antiquity. This is not at all obvious. In fact, there are multiple contexts in which it doesn't seem to be in play at all. This is one of the reasons why Snowden argued insistently that we cannot find any trace of a coherent construction of anti-blackness in antiquity. Okay. The problem, though, is that if we move some centuries out of the period of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, conventionally termed classical, if we start looking, for instance, at the transmission of ancient Greek texts in the early Islamic world and what's referred to as the Greco-Arabic translation movement, and the aftermath of that movement, we can begin to see, little by little, that ideas and constructions of difference that first arose in the ancient Mediterranean begin to get a new lease on life and are reformatted in the early and high Middle Ages, in all corners of the Mediterranean world and beyond. And they are reformatted in ways that begin to show a sharpening of an anti-black logic, right? So by the time, for instance, that we get to the writings of the great polymath and scholar Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah, we see there being a quite explicit anti-black discourse, and specifically a characterization of blacks from sub-Saharan communities as being precisely the kinds of individuals who deservedly get trafficked into slavery. I mean, even Khaldun is quite blunt about this in a way that is very alarming to encounter when you read the Muqaddimah. So by that point, we are now in the 1300s. We see that ideas that originate in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean inform some of Ibn Khaldun's thinking about which categories of individuals are to be racialized as black and therefore as fit for enslavement. And then this, in the 1500s and after, is taken over again and repurposed in the context of the transatlantic slave trade to inform the articulation of a new racializing discourse. But you see, this is where things become complicated for any reader of Isaac or of his statement, right? Because it's no longer a question of thinking that the transmission of these ideas from Greco-Roman antiquity is somehow linear, or that it comes to us unmediated without any intervening step. Actually, what is really an encouragement to scholarship, and what I think is really central to some of the work that colleagues and I have been doing over the past few years, is to think about all of these steps along the way where people could have mobilized concepts differently or thought otherwise, but for various reasons, some having to do very concretely with particular social, political, and economic considerations, decide, no, actually, it's this piece of the thinking of Greek authors or Roman authors or some hybridized version of the two that I'm going to take over and I'm going to use as the justification for a new or an emergently new system of exploitation predicated on race.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, what a full and really rich answer. Thanks, Dan-el. So I begin to think about, now I'm being practical and I'm actually going to ask for your advice. Derbo, in her book, talks about the importance of the work of museum professionals, of museum curators, educators, and professors, obviously, in being responsible in the way that we transmit this very sensitive information about race, because it seems to be, at least in the United States in the 21st century, it is a topic of import. And so as someone steeped in this knowledge, what advice would you give to curators working in the field today to try to make the nuances of this question more clearer, less opaque?
I love this question too. So one thought I have is very specific, and one thought I have is unfortunately rather general, but perhaps may serve as a spur for conversation. So the very specific thought, and one that is recipient of some focus and elaboration in Derbo's book, is that curators, museum staff, and all of those involved in the setup of exhibitions and the curation of knowledge within museums need to be really attentive to labeling, like exactingly meticulous about labeling. Because it emerges from simply evaluating things like the labeling and description of the Janiform Cantharos that I showed you, that labels are actually one way through which racializing concepts get enacted. Sometimes unwittingly, but always with the effect of affirming or retrenching perspectives on racial difference and the construction of racial difference in antiquity that may actually be markedly at variance with the original context or the receiving context of the artwork in question. Right? So labels matter, they're super important. The more general thought I have, though, is one for which I again derive inspiration from Derbo's book and also from the work of scholars such as Shelley Haley. What Haley and Derbo and Emily Greenwood and Patrice Rankine and others have sought to demonstrate over the past 2 decades and more, in Professor Haley's case, is that in order to develop clearer, more robust, and more productive understandings of race and racialization in antiquity, we need to be in conversations with folks in Black studies, doing work in critical race theory and in other fields. We need to recognize that our expertise is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to thinking about domains of the construction of difference for which there are other expertises and knowledges out there that can and should be brought into conversation. So what that means in practical terms is that folks working on Greco-Roman antiquities in a museum context will need to continuously retrain themselves. They will need to plug into dialogues that are alive and flourishing in other disciplines, including disciplines that are not given the conventional configuration of the master's and PhD programs where art historians and curators are trained, receiving nearly as much focus in their studies as they should. Right? So that's a more general thought, but I think over time it's also the thought that is likeliest to be generative.
Yes. No. I think, no, I do think it's important to consult other experts in the field, and really critical race theory does a lot to help us in interpreting the objects that we look at and interpret for the public as well, because we are certainly products of our time. Mm-hmm. And we need to be so conscious of the approach we bring into it, and all that. So, and then I think, may I just ask one last question, which is the one I have been dying to ask anyway. I would love to know, or would love for you to share with everyone how you became interested in this field, because it is so, it is a field that I think is still relevant today. That was another question I was going to ask you. Is it relevant? I think it is, because as we ourselves bring interpretations to the ancient world, it also helps us understand ours. But how did you come into this field?
So like any superhero, I have many origin stories. But so
I want the classics one.
But I'll focus in answering your question on one specific arc of experience. So my route into the study of the Greco-Roman world was not at all a direct one, although it was precipitated by an encounter with a book on the ancient Greeks and Romans that occurred when I was 8. So at the time, my family and I were living in a shelter in New York City, and there was a library in this shelter, and while on the hunt for books to read at night, I came across this book entitled How People Lived in Ancient Greece and Rome. And I was floored by this book. It had all this grandiloquent stuff about how the legacy of the Greeks and Romans lived with us today and all that. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And it had drawings too, which were cool. But what I try to stress to people nowadays is that this encounter came in the course of what I would later recognize, following the lead of philosophers such as Miranda Fricker, as epistemic injustice. And what I mean by this is that I happened to come across the Greeks and Romans at a time when I was searching for a language, a structure, a way of thinking about the world that would be directly resonant with my own experiences as a Dominican immigrant in New York City, only to discover that there wasn't anything that directly spoke to those experiences that was available to me in book form at the time, right? This shelter library was not particularly well stocked, although it did have a few books, right? There was, in later years, a move to try to engage in a form of rectification. I began to realize, first as a teenager and then as a young adult, that I needed additional resources to understand the nature of my family's background and origins and how that intersected with the decision I eventually made to study classics. And so to this end, I'll simply single out one experience I had as an undergrad. So my freshman year in the spring, I was in the midst of sampling all of these different courses in ancient Greece and Rome, but I also made a point to take a course in African American studies. It was a course taught by Cornell West on the writings of Du Bois, Baldwin, and Morrison. And it was one of the most incredible experiences I've had in any setting, because first of all, every single black and brown kid seemed to be in that lecture hall. And we were all there, like the first 3 rows was just us. And this was quite at variance with my classics classes, let me tell you. So it was like very affirming in that way. Like I had not, prior to that moment, been in a space at my predominantly white institution where there were just so many of us, all intent and focused on this one thing. But the second aspect of this course that I'll single out, a course that was really important for me because it helped me begin to develop a vocabulary for thinking and theorizing about racial difference and about representations of blackness, is that West did not lecture directly about the readings at all. In fact, every lecture was him just improvising and riffing in ways that I thought were like completely unrelated to what we were actually supposed to be studying in the class. I mean, sometimes he would like improvise like jazz melodies, or like other times he would like go on extended excursions about funk. I was captivated by it, but I was also sort of at a loss for trying to figure out what the exact connection between that performance and what we were covering in the class was. And it took me a long time and a great deal of deconstruction of my own mind to recognize that in that space, West was modeling for us how to construct forms of knowledge and engage in forms of world-making that were not directly responsive to the imperatives that we saw inscribed in other contexts of university life, whereby white professor with grizzled hair comes in and drones on gloriously for an hour about, a specific passage in a specific novel or whatever. That's not a bad thing, but what he was trying to show to us is that there were ways of producing knowledge in the university that were responsive in profoundly embodied ways to the facts of our racial identification as minoritized subjects in these spaces. And that, more than anything else, made it possible for me to begin thinking that one day I might be able to study racial difference as it bore equally on the worlds, the ancient Greek and Roman worlds that I studied, and as it bore on the construction of my own identity as a scholar. And that, to me, was really the game changer.
My gosh. I wish I had a professor like that. But
He's pretty dope. He's not bad.
Anyway, thank you so much, Dan-el. So, Paloma, you would like us to open this up? Oh, one more question. Ooh.
From the public.
From the public. Oh,
From
I'm
the people.
sorry.
I was under the impression that several of the Roman generals who became emperors were also of African origin. So I would think that racialization would come after the Roman era.
Thank you so much. That is a great question. So I've been teaching our big survey course on the Roman Empire at Princeton this term. I am pleased to report that it has 180 people and that we got mad people wanting to study Roman history. But one of the interesting things that we've noted in marching our way through the various Roman emperors is that with the ascent of Septimius Severus, we are dealing with an emperor of African origins, right? But here, it's important to be actually more precise. So Septimius Severus is definitely a person with Punic background, but again, we could try to be more precise. He has family that hails from a part of North Africa that is incorporated into the Roman Empire after a centuries-long struggle with the city-state of Carthage, and that in the course of the early and high empire produces this elite class that lays claim simultaneously to their identity as Roman subjects and also linguistically to a Punic past that links together Carthage as well as Carthage's home city in the Levant. What are we to do with this? What is the relationship between Septimius Severus's origins in North Africa and his characterization as African in our literary sources and any racial assignment that we might want to make as a result of this? Let's turn back one generation and look at a person named Fronto. So Fronto is a tutor to two individuals who later become emperor, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. And he is very close to Marcus Aurelius, with whom he exchanges extensive letters, and members of Marcus Aurelius's family. In one of the more revealing of these letters, writing in Greek, Fronto describes himself as a Libyan of the Libyan nomads. How are we to understand this? So there's been some excellent work recently by scholars such as Dan-el Padilla and others in trying to think through the many different layers of identity that we see receiving expression in a statement like this, right? What I will hold out to you as significant about that statement, and as significant about descriptions of Septimius Severus as an African, is that there is no clear or direct line that one can draw between their professed identities, as we see them represented in literary form, and a racial assignment of the kind that might be apparent or legible to us today, right? So from their claiming, respectively, Libyan identity or African identity, does it follow that they were black? This is like something worth deconstructing, right? And as a consequence, it's really also important to be quite clear about how we read statements like this critically. Certainly there were people in Septimius Severus's orbit who felt it important to hold up his sister as someone who spoke with such a thick accent that she was a source of embarrassment to her family, right? Well, again, what does that mean precisely? Are we to understand that accent too, and the ability to speak Latin in a certain way, is indicative of a certain form of racial assignment in the Roman Empire, separate from the various other kinds of racial assignment that we've noted earlier? This is another question that surfaces in response to yours. So as you can see, I'm just full of questions, really.
And that's the best thing. So anyway, I'm being told to wrap this up. I first want to thank Dan-el for sharing your, humor, scholarship, knowledge, and wisdom with us this evening. I would like to thank all of you for coming to the Boshell lecture series. I would also invite you to look at some of the objects that Dan-el showed us in our galleries. And finally, I would like to invite you to a reception outside so you can speak with Dan-el if you have further questions. But thank you all so much.
Thank you.